365 Acts of Meaningful Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples in Canada. Implement land acknowledgements at corporate events. Begin each meeting or event with a land acknowledgement that honors the Indigenous people whose traditional territory you are on. This practice not only shows respect, but also educates attendees about the history and significance of the land. By making land acknowledgements an integral part of your corporate culture, you foster a more inclusive and aware environment. Encourage your team to understand and appreciate the importance of these acknowledgements and ensure they are delivered with sincerity and respect. Establish partnerships with Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. Partner with Indigenous elders to bring cultural knowledge and guidance into corporate spaces. Hold sessions where elders share teachings and lead discussions on reconciliation. Offer Indigenous cultural awareness training for employees. Develop mandatory cultural awareness training for all employees that educates them on Indigenous histories, cultures, and contemporary issues, promoting a more inclusive workplace. Create mentorship programs for Indigenous youth. Partner with local Indigenous organizations to develop mentorship programs where corporate leaders provide career guidance and support for Indigenous youth. Collaborate with Indigenous storytellers and artists. Bring Indigenous storytellers and artists into your workplace to share their work, fostering a deeper understanding and appreciation of Indigenous culture. Develop corporate social responsibility programs focused on Indigenous communities. Create CSR initiatives that directly support Indigenous-led projects such as scholarships for Indigenous students or grants for community development. Sponsor Indigenous-led workshops on history and culture. Fund workshops led by Indigenous knowledge keepers on topics such as traditional, ecological knowledge, language preservation, and the impacts of colonization. Engage in two-way dialogue with Indigenous communities. Establish regular meetings between your corporate leaders and Indigenous community members to engage in open discussions about mutual concerns and opportunities for collaboration. Host Indigenous cultural days at your workplace. Organize events that celebrate Indigenous cultures, featuring traditional foods, performances, and storytelling, and invite Indigenous communities to lead and participate. Support Indigenous language revitalization programs. Partner with Indigenous language revitalization programs by offering financial support or volunteering corporate resources to help preserve and teach Indigenous languages. Create an internal reconciliation task force. Establish a corporate task force dedicated to developing and implementing reconciliation initiatives across all departments of the company. Incorporate Indigenous art and design in your office spaces. Collaborate with Indigenous artists to feature Indigenous art in your corporate offices, creating spaces that celebrate Indigenous culture and history. Partner with Indigenous businesses for corporate gifts. Purchase corporate gifts from Indigenous-owned businesses, ensuring that your purchases support Indigenous entrepreneurs. Organize cultural exchange programs between Indigenous and non-Indigenous employees. Create internal programs where Indigenous and non-Indigenous employees share cultural practices, fostering a deeper understanding and appreciation for each other's heritage. Support Indigenous-owned publishing and media companies. Partner with Indigenous-owned media companies to sponsor content that focuses on Indigenous issues, or to publish materials written by Indigenous authors. Participate in Orange Shirt Day. Encourage employees to participate in Orange Shirt Day, which raises awareness of the impacts of residential schools on Indigenous children and survivors. Host fundraising events for Indigenous community initiatives. Organize corporate fundraising events that benefit Indigenous-led projects, such as cultural preservation, health, or education programs. Sponsor Indigenous leadership conferences. Sponsor conferences that highlight Indigenous leadership and innovation in various industries, ensuring that Indigenous voices are central in shaping the future of the economy. Create Indigenous-centered employee resource groups, or ERGs. Develop an internal employee resource group for Indigenous employees and allies, providing a space for discussion, support, and advocacy within your organization. Include Indigenous perspectives in corporate sustainability efforts. Consult Indigenous leaders on sustainability initiatives, ensuring that Indigenous ecological knowledge is included in your company's environmental strategies. Create an Indigenous history education series for employees. Develop an internal education series that focuses on Indigenous history, including the impacts of colonization, treaties, and the ongoing work of reconciliation. Support Indigenous language apps and digital tools. Invest in or partner with developers creating apps or digital tools that help teach and preserve Indigenous languages. These tools are essential for keeping languages alive and relevant in today's digital world. By supporting these initiatives, you contribute to cultural preservation and help ensure that future generations can access and learn their ancestral languages. This not only enriches the digital landscape, but also fosters a deeper understanding and an appreciation of Indigenous cultures. Collaborate with Indigenous filmmakers on corporate videos. Partner with Indigenous filmmakers to produce corporate videos that highlight your company's reconciliation efforts or showcase Indigenous culture. Offer paid time off for employees to volunteer with Indigenous organizations. Provide employees with paid volunteer days to work with local Indigenous organizations, encouraging them to contribute directly to reconciliation efforts. Host a corporate reconciliation roundtable. Organize roundtable discussions with Indigenous leaders and other corporate partners to share best practices and develop innovative approaches to reconciliation in the business sector. Collaborate with Indigenous chefs for corporate events. Hire Indigenous chefs to cater corporate events, celebrating Indigenous culinary traditions and supporting Indigenous-owned culinary businesses. Incorporate Indigenous knowledge into corporate wellness programs. Partner with Indigenous wellness practitioners to incorporate traditional healing practices, such as smudging or meditation, into your company's wellness programs. Fund Indigenous-led health research. Provide funding for Indigenous-led health research initiatives that focus on the unique health challenges faced by Indigenous peoples, ensuring that solutions are developed within an Indigenous framework. Host a reconciliation speaker series. Invite Indigenous leaders, academics, and activists to speak at your company, educating employees about the importance of reconciliation and how they can contribute. Support Indigenous legal advocacy organizations. Provide financial or legal support to organizations advocating for Indigenous rights, ensuring Indigenous communities have access to justice and legal resources. Include Indigenous consultation in major corporate decisions. Ensure that Indigenous communities are consulted on corporate decisions that may impact their land, resources, or people, respecting their sovereignty and rights. Develop scholarships for Indigenous students. Create scholarships specifically for Indigenous students in fields such as business, environmental studies, or health, helping to create future Indigenous leaders. Host a corporate day of action for reconciliation. Dedicate one day each year to corporate-wide volunteer work with Indigenous communities, making tangible contributions to reconciliation efforts. Partner with Indigenous-led nonprofits for community projects. Collaborate with Indigenous-led nonprofits on projects that focus on community development, environmental stewardship, or education. Celebrate National Indigenous Peoples Day. Organize corporate-wide celebrations on National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is June 21st, featuring Indigenous speakers, performances, and cultural activities. Support Indigenous artists through corporate commissions. Commission Indigenous artists to create art for corporate offices, publications, or events, ensuring that Indigenous culture is celebrated and visible within your organization. Develop internships for Indigenous students. Create paid internship programs specifically for Indigenous students, providing them with professional experience and mentorship in your industry. Host Indigenous book clubs or reading circles. Organize book clubs or reading circles for employees focused on Indigenous authors and literature, encouraging reflection and discussion on Indigenous experiences and perspectives. Support Indigenous-led sports initiatives. Sponsor Indigenous-led sports leagues or events, promoting physical health, teamwork, and community engagement in Indigenous youth and adults. Engage Indigenous ecologists in environmental impact studies. When conducting environmental impact assessments for corporate projects, work with Indigenous ecologists to ensure Indigenous knowledge is included in your sustainability efforts. Partner with Indigenous-owned businesses for event planning. Hire Indigenous-owned businesses to plan and execute corporate events, supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs and promoting culturally relevant experiences. Support Indigenous language immersion programs. Provide funding or volunteer support to Indigenous language immersion programs, which help revive and sustain endangered Indigenous languages. Create employee matching gift programs for Indigenous organizations. For example, implement a matching gift program where your company matches employee donations to Indigenous-led charities or organizations, doubling the impact of their contributions. Sponsor youth development programs in Indigenous communities. For example, provide financial support for programs that focus on leadership development, education, and job training for Indigenous youth. Work with Indigenous communities to address water access issues. For example, collaborate with Indigenous communities on water access projects, helping to install or improve water infrastructure in remote areas. Incorporate Indigenous governance models into corporate structures. Learn from and incorporate Indigenous governance models, such as consensus-based decision-making, into corporate governance structures, creating more inclusive and equitable decision-making processes. Offer financial literacy workshops for Indigenous communities. Partner with Indigenous organizations to offer comprehensive financial literacy workshops that help community members develop essential skills in budgeting, investing, and financial planning. These workshops can empower individuals to make informed financial decisions. Additionally, create a corporate apprenticeship program specifically designed for Indigenous workers, providing them with hands-on experience and mentorship opportunities. This initiative will not only enhance their financial knowledge, but also open doors to career advancement and economic stability within their communities. Establish apprenticeship programs that provide Indigenous workers with hands-on experience in your industry, helping to build a skilled Indigenous workforce. Sponsor Indigenous film festivals. Provide financial support for Indigenous film festivals that showcase films by Indigenous filmmakers, highlighting Indigenous perspectives and stories in the media. Engage in corporate advocacy for Indigenous rights. Use your company's influence to advocate for Indigenous rights at the local, provincial, and national levels, speaking out on issues such as land rights, water access, and justice for Indigenous communities. Visit bearstandingtall.com to download the full version of 365 Acts of Meaningful Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples in